The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 961 An End. Kuno, the now 14-year-old boy, looked up at his older sister, Kava. Both of them had been working for months now, something wildly out of their expectations, but the two of them paused now. Something was in the air, and it made him afraid. Originally, they meant to spend some time at the inn and then go back. But as they dug through the soil, as they worked with the plants, as they plucked fruits from trees, they were farming, but what they were actually growing was their own strength. A week of working at the greenhouse at the inn allowed them to grow a lot more than their ancestral training ever could. Even their parents were taken aback when they saw them. Unsure if the inn was really the cause, the parents joined them as well. To their entire family's great surprise, even their parents began to see rapid growth in their strength. That's when they realized, whether it was the water from the well of invigoration, or the soil nurtured with the most potent fertilizers, or the air that was pure and filled with energy, they all joined together to make the greenhouse the best place to train they could ever hope to find. The lycanthropes had been losing the war in their home country. The human princess wielding secret powers had fallen in love with one of those absurd, shining bats, which turned the tides in their favor. To protect the two, as well as train them, they had been sent to the inn. Then, the inn stopped accepting new guests. Just to make the most of the opportunity, they stayed and continued to train. Then a few days ago, a strange heaviness filled the inn. They sensed something amiss, but assured by the familiar staff, they decided to stay. A few more days passed, and the heaviness only continued to increase. Just as Kuno was considering actually leaving, there was a change in the air. Something was happening. Then they heard the innkeeper's voice. At the other side of the inn, the mountain man was dreaming. His system made it so that his daily cycle was actually several years long, so he spent a lot of time sleeping and resting. But even within his dream, he heard a familiar voice. It was calm and reassuring, but he could not help but think that the voice did not belong in this dream. Cassandra, who was still sitting atop the midnight mountain, observed everything around her with rapt attention, as she did not want to miss a single thing. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. As his mental countdown reached 0, he received a series of notifications from the system. The first was slightly alarming, or rather had the potential to cause alarm, so he used the system to spread his voice out across the inn. Dear guests, fellow workers. Do not be alarmed. The Midnight Inn is about to undergo a massive renovation, because of which the teleportation function has been shut down completely. Until the renovation is completed, it is not possible to leave the inn. He used his utmost to speak those words in as soothing and calm a voice as possible, for he really needed everyone to not panic. That was because there were many more notifications he had received, and he needed to communicate the information to his guests as well. During the renovation process, you may witness some alarming scenes, but you will not be harmed at all. You can sit back and enjoy the scene, treating everything as if it were just an illusion. For those with a slightly higher cultivation realm, you can also pay attention and observe. This may be beneficial for your comprehension. He did not elaborate any more. Instead, he just looked out at his inn. Suddenly it made sense. In his visions of the future, he saw the inn destroyed in fire right before his eyes, but he remained calm nonetheless. It was because the realm was being reborn, but before that, it had to be utterly destroyed. Massive balls of fire appeared in the air, and began their descent. Fortunately, the second notification he had received informed him that the system would protect everyone and everything during the destruction of this realm. So much for all the preparations they made. He continued to look as the first fireball crashed into the ground, and sent a rippling shockwave through the inn. With his eye that could see laws, Lex saw both the unfolding destruction, and the rebirth hidden within. The birth of the Midnight Realm had begun. End of Volume 3. Chapter 962 Offline. The lead-up to the final day was not slow. Lex did not spend the days looking at the countdown, waiting with anticipation for the moment the big change happened. Instead, the final days were extremely busy. The inn was massive and prepping all of it for the big change was a monumental task that occupied the entire inn workforce. Like ants, scurrying around in a rush to get their jobs done, all the workers were once again deployed, bringing forth a flurry of activity. The guests had noticed it too, and may have been concerned about what was happening if the workers didn't all have an excited energy about them. But the mood of the workers was one thing, and the building pressure in the inn was another. Lex would have thought more guests would have left when the pressure started increasing, but the opposite happened. Guests actually stopped leaving, as they were all curious about what was going to happen. Besides checking every once in a while to ensure his guests were fine, Lex did not have the time to fret over them. The last 5 days, Lex spent bringing his cultivation level to the very brink of a breakthrough, and making sure he was in the optimal condition. In between cultivation sessions he went to the hot tub room to relax and even got a haircut from Harry to bring his state to its absolute peak. Just to be absolutely sure, he even went to Cassandra one more time to check if his state was the best it could be. As it turned out, it was not. Lex had once again forgotten to sleep and eat. It was funny how easy it was to drop old habits once they transitioned from a need to a luxury. On the final day, Lex slept for 6 hours, and fed on some extremely nourishing spiritual fruits. As the hours closed in, Lex teleported to his office and completely blocked out the world. He emptied his mind from all his thoughts, and meditated to calm himself down. When he finally opened his eyes, the big change was only a few seconds away. He stood in front of the window in his office, and looked out at the inn as he waited for the countdown to finish. When it reached 0, he heard a familiar ting. He tried to teleport, but of course that was not working either. "Mary, are you there?" he asked out loud. For a time, the only sound Lex heard was that of rumbling and falling meteors. But eventually, a very faint voice reached his ears, as if through some kind of insulation barrier. "I'm here," she replied, her voice somber and melancholic. "Don't tell me I'm going to be stuck like this for a few million years," he said. He was absolutely certain it would not actually take so long. The formation of the realm really will take that long. But what was left out was that the flow of time will play a big role in speeding up the process, or at least, you yourself won't have to go through those millions of years. When the realm stabilizes enough to support life, the time flow will also become more stable, although I highly doubt it will be the same as the origin realm even then. Whatever the case, I expect that the timing of the formation of the Midnight Realm will coincide with the destruction of this, so we should be ready to move over just before the space collapses. Lex did not immediately respond. Instead, he walked out of the office and looked all around the inn as the intense flames burned everything to cinders. He could not help but recall his first day when he was designing the inn. He wanted to replicate a lord's manor because he thought that would be cool. Even then, he had done such a half-hearted job. He had come so far now, but somehow, with his own hands, or through his own actions rather, he had burnt down everything he had created. It was for the better, but it still caused him to feel forlorn. "Mary, you remember the first time we met? What did you say back then?" "That you're an augmented reality avatar to help me get used to the system. But with all the system features offline, how are you still talking?" Chapter 963 Shooting Star. Lex waited, but Mary did not respond. It did not matter. Soon, many questions would be answered. He realized that one of the things holding him back was his mistrust of the system. He did not trust something that basically controlled or affected his entire life. There was no way that was going to have a positive outcome. Fortunately, he had thought of a way to deal with this issue. He put the thought out of his mind and began to stroll through the inn one last time before it was all destroyed. He didn't know why the destruction of it was necessary, but as long as nobody was hurt he could overcome it. In the air, several meteors struck the flying ship, but as a property of the inn, the ship too was under protection, and so it suffered no harm. It probably had a killer view though. It was unfortunate that he could not teleport to it at the moment, but that was fine. A dove flew to Lex and sat on its shoulder, and firmly pressed itself against the side of his face, tucking itself under his ear. It was trembling, and even though there was no threat to it, he could not explain that to the bird, so all he could do was let it sit as he walked around. In the distance, Lex saw the idiot Fenrir riding the shockwaves through the air as if it was surfing, and Little Blue was frantically trying to catch up. At least someone was having fun. He could see, in the distance, near the Midnight Manor, dozens of guests had gathered in a small crowd and were huddled together. They looked frightened and panicked. Chances were they would leave the inn and never come back after this was over, but Lex firmly believed that they would come around. After all, this was just the beginning. What was most interesting was that, due to the security provided, the mountain man was sleeping through this disaster, as if he really were nothing more than just a mountain. The sky lanterns, though unharmed, fell to the ground, making the inn feel very incomplete without them. Main Street was a complete mess. The buildings remained untouched, and yet there was fire everywhere, filling the air with black, corrosive smoke. A particularly big meteor fell, and this time instead of a bright, golden flame, the fire was green. It fell on the other side of the Midnight Mountain, so he could only hear the devastation, and feel some of the tremors. He missed the big impact. Lex wondered if he could possibly take a sample of the fire. He had done the same with the flame during his test in the temple, and then given it to Luther since he could absorb different flames. He didn't know if Luther had successfully absorbed it, or if he even liked it. But collecting different kinds of flames would be useful. There was also an inn worker who could control lightning. He'd heard from Velma that Z had a big crush on her. He wondered if she could absorb lightning too. Lex decided to gather some just in case. "Just relax," Lex said to the horrified elf. The meteor, much larger than the previous one, crashed. The impact was greater, and the shockwave fiercer, which meant that they were launched even faster and farther than the previous time. Lex could not help but laugh. This was actually quite fun, and it gave him an incredible view. The elf initially screamed, but was actually startled when she realized that she was completely unharmed. Then she looked around and was mesmerized. It was like she was witnessing a painting unfolding in real life. Never before had such utter destruction looked so beautiful. Lex's laughter was infectious, and soon the elf began laughing as well. The relief of surviving, and the euphoria of such an unexpected yet wonderful ride flooded her. The sounds of their laughter echoed in the surrounding lands, reaching the crowd of guests who had huddled on the nearby hill. At first they were horrified. But then, they were intrigued. When their initial fear was reduced ever so slightly, they remembered the words of the innkeeper. They were absolutely safe. Some of their trust in the Midnight Inn was beginning to return. A particularly daring group broke off from the crowd, and made their way to a falling meteor. It was difficult to control the direction they flew in, and harder to stay together unless they were holding hands. As a result, soon, a number of guests could be seen flying through the air, filled with excitement as they tried to yell out to their friends. From up above, a hatch in the massive spaceship opened, and a number of guests and inn workers began to glide through the air, astride flying peacocks. The mood was infectious. Even without communicating, the idea of flying through the air spread, and soon the number of flying guests increased. What was most interesting to see was that some guests, who were deep in meditation, had a sound-insulating barrier around them as well. So when their abodes were struck by meteors, they too were launched through the air, still in their meditation pose, completely unaware of what was happening. The spirits, who could not join in the fun, began to fly through the air anyway. They were being hit by severe FOMO, fear of missing out. In just half an hour, the feelings of horror and fear were completely gone, and instead a game of extreme air tag had begun between all the guests as they tried to control the direction they were launched in, and tried to reunite with their friends. At some point, Lex finally came across Fenrir, and decided to sit upon its back. The pup was absolutely filled with joy as its entire home had turned into a massive playground. But its excited expression paused for just a moment as it had a strange thought as it looked at the sea of flames beneath it. If the heat given off by a meteor of 50 feet in diameter is uniform, and it is around 10,000 degrees Celsius at the moment of impact, one could cook 1,129,200 marshmallows per meteor. The thought was strange and intrusive, and it did not know why it had that thought, especially since all the meteors were off different sizes, and the heat distribution could never be uniform. Perhaps it was just hungry. It pushed away those thoughts and focused on enjoying itself. Then immediately it turned its head in a certain direction and looked into the distance. Someone really was roasting marshmallows over there. Chapter 964 The Big Bang. What started out as a chaotic and fear-inducing event soon turned into a party. Extreme emotions, whether positive or negative, led to extreme results. So naturally, when the fear for their lives elapsed, the elation of having avoided death gripped most of the guests. With Lex, Fenrir, and the elf setting an example, it was only expected that the others soon followed. Up in the clouds, Cassandra ignored the festive environment down below, as her focus was solely concentrated on the destruction of the realm. She could understand a lot better than everyone else exactly what was happening, which is why she did not even allow herself a second to relax. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, even for someone immortal, so she could not miss it. What others saw was simply fiery meteors falling from the sky, but she could see that the laws that held the together were being unraveled, slowly and systematically. The fire was just a smokescreen to hide what was truly happening underneath. Even with a mere moment of contemplation, she could identify why the innkeeper may be doing things like this. He was essentially erasing all traces of the Midnight Inn from this place, so that in the future, if anyone stumbled upon this place, they could not peer into the secrets of the inn. The smokescreen was only even effective because the fire spread from those meteors itself had a very destructive property, making it easy for one to believe that all traces had simply been erased by fire. In truth, he was making it so that not even peering into the past, or conducting some kind of powerful divination in this place, would yield any results. She could also see that the process was being artificially slowed down, for whatever reason. She could not understand why that would be, but then again, how could she truly understand everything a Tao Lord did? Cassandra was merely studying everything that she could all around her. The isolating barrier that had surrounded not only her but also all the others was especially interesting as well because she could tell that it served some other purpose. It was just that the other purpose had yet to be revealed. Down below, the games continued for as long as the meteors fell. Whether it was the cultivators who had incredibly long lives, or the young children who were, for the first time, tasting the sweet fruits life had to offer, they both had no limit for how much they could play. Unfortunately for them, there was a limit on the meteors. Eventually, when the entire surface of the inn was covered in flames, and the water had all evaporated and the ground had become hard, like basked tiles, meteors stopped falling. But by then, the guests and workers had all gathered together to form one large group, for the unusualness of the situation made them somewhat insecure. Many guests could not help but ask what kind of renovations were going on, or when they could expect to be allowed to leave. But the workers had no real answers. Lex had only given them limited information, not because he didn't trust them, but because he wanted this to be as much of a surprise to them as anyone. Some knew more than others, but they ultimately did not say much. In the end, all they could do was remind them of the innkeeper's instructions. Right before this all began, he did specify that for those with a keen eye, this could be a great opportunity. It looked like an ever-extending piece of rock, floating in space, except that the rock was so massive that no space could be seen beneath them at all. New notification: all guests will be kept isolated from the flow of time while the realm finishes stabilizing. Streams of golden energy, visible to the naked eye, seemed to appear from the air itself, and began bathing the massive rock. More and more streams of energy appeared, all in vibrant colors the likes of which Lex had never even seen or imagined before. It was like art, if art could not be seen but felt directly from the soul, as he did not feel like he was seeing the colors as much as he was feeling them. Lights, so blindingly bright that they threatened to sear Lex's brain itself, covered the land while Lex continued to watch. After all, he was still under the protection of the system. The rock broke into fragments so small they were difficult to see, but suddenly their view changed, or they appeared closer to the fragments, and Lex realized that even though so perceived minuscule fragments were absolutely enormous. He could not understand how big they were, because he had nothing to scale them with. He did not know how close or far he was. For all he knew, each fragment could be the size of a star system, or maybe even a galaxy. Reality changed in front of his eyes, a solid lost meaning. The rock fragments turned into liquid, and then into energy, and then into something else. Lex lost all concept of what he was seeing, and when he looked around, he found that almost everyone besides him was in a daze. Only very few still seemed to be lucid, such as Cassandra, a few devils, Z, and a few other notable guests. Even the likes of Anita and Kawain, two immortals, were caught in a daze as they looked at whatever was happening. He looked back down, determined to memorize everything he saw, even if he couldn't understand it. Everything was mixed together, as if in a melting pot. At a certain point, Lex was no longer even sure he was seeing things, or if his mind was just creating abstract images in a futile attempt to piece together what was happening around him. The only thing, he realized, that seemed familiar to him, was time. Time continued to flow, though he was certain that it was flowing much faster than he could actually perceive. Perhaps, what he felt as 1 second was actually 100,000 years. Then, at some point, all the color in existence vanished, returning everything to darkness for a fraction of a second, before resulting in a massive explosion. Lex did not feel the shockwave, nor did he see the explosion. He only saw white, and a part of him knew that he had just experienced, to some degree, certain events that happened before the Big Bang that was theorized to have created the origin realm, at least by humans on Earth. Now he was experiencing the Big Bang itself. Chapter 965 Epiphany. Lex's achievements in life were not insignificant, and his skill and knowledge were far beyond his own level. But no matter how impressive he was thoroughly out of his league right now. In fact, even though he did not understand anything he was seeing, he could feel that even with his lack of comprehension, his cultivation realm was somehow, it was not increasing, but getting deeper, whatever that meant. Though, with his soul, he could feel time passing by, he lost track of exactly how much time had elapsed. The white light seemed to extend into infinity, and had encompassed all of reality. Perhaps a part of his mind was numbed so that he would not feel the effects of what felt like years passing by, or maybe the light only lasted a brief moment, but the light overwhelmed his brain, causing it to lag, just like his old PC used to. He could swear that, somewhere in the back, he heard the sovereign turtle say "oh dear." But at the same time, the concept of sound seemed strange. As if sound itself did not exist yet. Someone snapped their fingers, or maybe it was the universe, or this new realm that snapped into place. The next thing Lex knew, he was standing above beautiful lands that extended into the horizon. A part of Lex's mind realized that at some point, he too had become dazed like many of the guests, and he was finally waking from it. He looked down, directly below him, and the world seemed to be moving incredibly fast. It was like someone was playing a city builder video game and wanted to skip the building part, so they hit the fast forward button. Only, time was not flowing 2 or 3 times faster. No, it was moving thousands of times faster. He could see the landscape changing underneath him. The greenery he saw was not plants, but instead it was something he was much too familiar with. It was lava. It was moving and flowing, forming the contours of not just the land, but the very laws that governed them. His concept of defense and toughness were changing, and even the way his body recovered and restored were being altered as if to mimic everything he was seeing. But the change was all too much. Lex did not realize when he closed his eyes, or when he blocked off his senses. He did not realize what was happening all around him, because even before his body touched an iota of the energy he was expecting to experience in the new realm, his breakthrough began. It was the most seamless experience he ever had. There was no obstruction as his realm changed, and the energy within his body began to come out of his core and fill every single inch of his body. But there was a problem. Every breakthrough required a massive amount of energy, but the isolation barrier was preventing him from touching upon any of the energy in the new realm. It had judged that the energy was, as of yet, too potent for any of them. It only made sense, for not even the mythical beings associated with the birth of a new realm had been born yet. That is how chaotic the energy in the realm was. But his process had begun, and his body required energy. The isolation barrier around him, functioning solely on predefined programs, thin just enough to let the slightest sliver of energy through. Much in the way that Lex's body had turned to ash when it touched the chaos energy released by dissolving space, his body began to turn to mush as it touched this new energy. But that no longer mattered. His cultivation technique was working in full, and it was channeling the energy into his body, not his golden core, so Lex did not immediately die. This was not a coincidence, as the moment he sensed danger, Lex woke up from his epiphany and took control of his breakthrough. He had lost a small opportunity by waking prematurely, but at the same time, his cultivation technique was using the energy that created new realms to create his new body, so he also gained a massive opportunity. The lotus on his back also trembled, and exited his body for the first time since it had latched onto him. It too wanted to break through to a new realm. Chapter 966 Cultivation Levels. Cultivation progressed differently for different beings. The cultivation levels, as humans identified them, were a good standard to measure strength by, but other races may skip over certain realms. A very simple example of this was the fact that countless races were born at a higher cultivation level, such as dragons. So while an upgrade for a human may result in extensive growth in power, such as moving from the nascent realm to the earth immortal realm, that did not mean much on a universal scale. That was just the level of growth a human body and soul could sustain, before they needed to strengthen or amend their being, making it more amenable to more growth. So, for a world seed lotus, growth looked like transforming from a lotus into a world. The power difference between those levels was absolutely massive. But lotus did not immediately burst into a metamorphosis and begin transforming into the world. It simply took in the scene of whatever was happening. It had been doing the same from Lex's body, but since Lex blocked out all his senses to focus on his own breakthrough, it had to come out. But it was on the verge. It could feel that observing the birth of a new realm would be immensely beneficial for it, and its entire species. It had not forgotten the talk Lex had with it back at the temple, and the idea was beginning to take root. Why should it settle for a planet if it can be an entire star system, or maybe something even greater? Why accept death when it can continue to support its friends, or others of its race? Lotus mind did not work in the same way as a human's, and so it perceived existence very differently. It was very purpose-oriented, so much so that even death was justifiable, or even recommended, if it could achieve its purpose. But if there was a higher purpose, then even if it had to make the sacrifice of not dying, it would do so. Lightsful Omicron M. Lex's body, meanwhile, was going through an unusual change where it was dissolving and regenerating at a visible pace. This was not an actual part of his realm breakthrough, but because it was happening simultaneously, his cultivation technique was reforging his body and its tolerances much faster. This was not even mentioning the many subsequent problems he would have in the later cultivation levels if he did not achieve it in some manner. Lex himself did not have enough of an understanding of the higher realms to come up with a cultivation technique, which could take into account the many changes he would need to face, which is why he had to grow his cultivation technique. Although he may have overachieved by a large margin, his cultivation technique had evolved, and he could now cultivate to higher realms once more. The difference was that instead of his soul leaving his body, he was gaining a new ability altogether. He was gaining the ability to turn his physical body directly into a soul state. When he achieved that, Lex would unknowingly be able to enter all three states that made his being. His physical being was his ordinary state, and through mind meld he could turn into thought, or spirit, if seen through a different lens. Being able to turn his being into a soul state would finally allow him to achieve all three. It would also make him endlessly more resilient. Back when Lex had entered the temple of fasting, he had survived despite the thorough destruction of his organs because, well, as long as even a piece of meat in his body was still alive, his soul would continue to exist. That meant that as long as his golden core was unharmed, and could supply his body with even a minuscule amount of energy, he could continue to live. Now, though, even that requirement was no longer necessary. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 967 today. If there was one thing Lex was grateful for, it was the fact that his body being dissolved did not cause him any pain. Maybe his nerves and pain receptors were being dissolved as well, which prevented him from feeling much of anything, really. But even so, whenever his body was reformed, he could feel it was much more powerful. For regular humans, the nascent realm elevated their soul strength primarily, with only minor additions in other aspects. For Lex, it was completely irrelevant which aspect was strengthened, because they would all mutually strengthen one another. But the increase in strength was just a side effect. The main change was that his body was being altered in a way that it would be able to turn into the soul state. That meant that in the future, even if his golden core was crushed, he would not die as long as a single speck of his body remained. Of course, gaining the energy to once again regrow his body was an entirely separate issue that would need to be addressed at the time. Cassandra, who was by far the person who was benefiting the most out of everyone here, looked at Lex momentarily. She was not at all surprised that his breakthrough was strange. In fact, it was expected. If Lex ever did anything ordinary, she would be disappointed instead. Lex himself did not know he was being judged by those around him. At least he was not causing any visions or strange phenomena this time around, not that he would have been able to do much about it even if he was. Once he was sure that his cultivation would continue to cycle on its own, and that he had adapted enough not to be instantly crippled in case some more energy from the new realm entered his body, he turned his attention inwards. Diverting his focus during a breakthrough was not advisable, and Lex had not planned to do it in this way. But now that things were in motion, he had to adapt. After all, this was important too. Lex did not delude himself into thinking he could force the system into doing anything. The power it contained was far beyond what he could even imagine. But he could at least resist with his soul. He could at least make the process a little bumpy. The sound of an exhausted sigh reached Lex's ear, and Mary's figure appeared in front of him. This was inside his own soul, so a projection could not reach here. For Mary to appear here was as good as admitting that she had a soul, and was not just a mere projection. "Why are you doing this, Lex? Haven't you benefited enough from the system? Hasn't your life improved tremendously because of it? Why do you still doubt everything?" "Because I just can't help but shake the feeling, Mary, that not everything is as it seems. Everything the system has given me is too good to be true. Literally, it is too good. Countless immortals have not had the level of opportunities that I have, and it has only been a few years. Such a good deal, how can it exist? I just can't believe it. For something so great to exist, it must have a similarly great price. I cannot even imagine what I will have to pay for all this." Lex's voice was not accusatory, as Mary had expected. He was not angry or suspicious. He was just using common sense. It was because he had gotten so many great things that he had to take precautions. After all, he did not want to lose them. Time and time again, he had suffered due to momentary bouts of arrogance. He did not want to make the same mistake when it mattered most. "Today, once and for all, I'm going to get my answers. Don't think I don't have many already. Isn't the reason you look down on me so much because my level on the cosmic ascendant spectrum level is too low? Yet you fawn and please the turtle any chance you get, exactly because of its level. Well, I am no longer the person I was when you met me. Today, you will respond to me." The golden ball of the system vibrated softly. Chapter 968 New Rules. Mary and Lex both looked towards the ball as it vibrated, hummed softly. It was very important that the system respond to him, for he did not wish to take drastic measures. "You should not compare yourself to the sovereign galactic turtle," a young, immature voice spoke out loud. It almost sounded cute. "It is rude to the turtle. You should be honored that it gives you so much attention, not throw a tantrum about feeling inferior." Despite everything he had been through, Lex could not help his lip from twitching. He was under so much pressure, facing off against the system that had given him so much trouble, and here it was, with the cutest little voice, instructing him not to misbehave. The fact that the system sounded so sincere, instead of condescending as he had imagined, somehow made the situation worse. Or better. He could not tell. "So you respond at last," Lex said, focusing on the matter. He could not afford to get distracted. "I have less than 20% functionality, and no mouth. I don't know how you expect me to answer you. Sending remarks and notifications already demands so much of my attention. Don't you pretend like you sent those remarks for me," Lex nearly snapped. "You were just enjoying making fun of me." For a few seconds the system did not respond, almost as if it felt shy. "What do you want to talk about?" it ultimately asked. "I don't have the energy to sustain this. Even now, the only reason I can communicate with you like this is because of the energy in the new realm. By the way, this is breaking a lot of rules, so expect a lot of quests to make up for it." What is the purpose of the systems?" he asked, after deliberation. "I can tell you, but it'd be pointless to do so." "In that case, let me answer a different question. You asked why the powerful people don't know about systems. It's because if the wrong person learns details they shouldn't, their memories are wiped. If you ever meet someone with a system and amnesia, then pretty much that's what happened to them. If you ask the wrong question, your memory will be wiped too, but you'll be stuck with the bill anyway. Better be careful." The system was speaking like a little boy, explaining the rules of the house to his even younger brother. The innocence and simplicity with which it spoke of earth-shattering things was both entertaining and horrifying. So someone, or something, out there was wiping memories left and right, regardless of one's cultivation level. That was not scary at all. How can I be sure that you won't harm me in the future?" he asked, unsure of what he was even allowed to ask. What was the point of getting an answer if his memory would be wiped a moment later? I'm bound to you, pretty much. If something happens to you, then I get hurt as well. So I have no incentive to hurt you, unless you fail a quest with a clearly outlined punishment." Lex grit his teeth. This was not nearly as revealing as he was hoping. But it was still progress, in a way. "I don't want to fuse you to my soul." That's fine. But it will slow down my recovery, and you won't gain the control over my abilities as much as you wish. It's your loss, to be honest." "That's fine. But speaking of control, I have some things I want to talk to you about. Moving forward, I want to change the way the inn functions. We need new rules." Chapter 969 Win-Win. How cooperative the system was being was completely unanticipated on Lex's behalf, and threw him for a loop. But the problem was, even though the system was being cooperative, Lex learned nothing new. So not only would Lex have to pay some kind of penalty for his questions, he was getting no real answers either. The only assurance he had that the system was not out to harm him was its word. For now, he would live with that. What was most important to him, however, was to make sure that the system did not fuse with his soul, and that he got some say in how the inn operated from now on. He was adamant on rejecting the fusion, for his soul was literally him. If an unfathomably strong system, which also had a soul of its own, fused and became a part of him, Lex would have no idea if he would still be Lex moving forward, or he would be the system. Or perhaps, he'd be something entirely new altogether. Since he did not know how amenable the system would be to his demands and requests, he mixed in his true purpose amidst his many other concerns. Perhaps it was unnecessary caution, but he took his life very seriously. "I just told you that rejecting the fusion would mean you have less control over the system. Now you literally want more." "That's not how this works." Lex snorted. These would be perhaps the most important negotiations of his life, at least in the near future. There was no way he would go easy on the system. Now that he had recovered from the surprise, he had gathered himself up to be immune to the charm of the system's innocent voice. He turned to look at Mary, who was only silently watching from the side. What was her role in all this? Based on all the information he had, he could venture a guess. Before we get into those things, what about her? How does she fit into this? Oh, that is one of the simpler questions you've asked. There's no punishment for this either. The entity who you have named as Mary is actually a soul remnant as my previous host, before I became the Midnight Inn. The short of it is that she faced an enemy she could not defeat and ended up dying, and I was also destroyed. But, through means I do not fully understand, she made herself a part of the system, yet has still retained her soul, and somehow survived actual death. The more the system recovers, the more she will also recover. But do not worry, she can no longer be the host, nor does she have any control over the system. In fact, she can't do anything that breaks the system's rules at all. Is there any way I can free her from the system? It's completely impossible. I do not know how she managed to do what she did, and she cannot tell you what she did either because that would entail revealing the inner workings of the system. The rules prevent her from divulging such secrets. So, only if you gain your own understanding of the systems can you even begin to start thinking of a way to separate her. Lex rubbed his chin as he contemplated what to do next. He was not too surprised about the revelation about Mary. In fact, he sort of already expected it. Now he just needed to think about how he could use it to his own benefit. Chapter 970 Begin Negotiations. Lex observed Mary for a moment as he considered his options. Considering the extremely high level of the Midnight Inn, even in its damaged state, and the fact that Mary was its previous host, he could conclude that she must have been extremely impressive. That was not even mentioning the fact that she had somehow done something to the system that even the system itself could not identify. Thinking back, Mary's involvement in his growth had been monumental, and extremely limited at the same time. In the first few days of the inn, Lex recalled that she had been somewhat frustrated at his decisions. But then, almost as if she went through a personality shift, she stopped expressing her own opinions, but only performed the tasks he asked of her, occasionally giving some advice now and again. But her advice was always layered, and was presented in a way that allowed Lex to figure things out on his own. For example, the idea to look for loopholes in the system's rules was something she suggested. Lex imagined her like an adult watching a baby trying to solve a puzzle. The obvious mistakes must have been excruciating to watch. She was also limited in what she could actually tell him due to the many restrictions the system put on her. Is there any way I can talk to her more freely? Lex asked the system, rather than Mary herself. Many things she cannot tell me because of the system's restrictions. But what if I'm only asking for advice? Advice is strictly a gray area, the system answered nonchalantly. Hosts are encouraged to make their own decisions, but many systems give varying degrees of hints. It's up to the system and the host. If you're asking for ways to reduce the restrictions on her, I cannot give you those. As I have no idea what she's done, I cannot risk giving her more freedom. This time, it was Lex who let out an exhausted sigh. That was one of his greatest concerns, that the system was so much more powerful than him that he could not resist it at all if it wanted to harm him. A random quest in the early days had threatened him with death. Maybe if that hadn't happened Lex would not be so distrusting of it, but it had, and there was nothing he could do about it. But he did not have the time to dwell on such things. He could feel that his breakthrough was about to enter its next phase soon, and he'd no longer be able to spare any attention to negotiating with the system, so he had to use his time wisely. Looking back at the glowing golden ball of light, Lex went over his priorities for the development of the inn. With his thoughts cleared out, he began listing his demands. I plan on using a lockdown token anyway, but since I don't know how long that can last, we'll start with that. I want to limit what areas can access the inn. It cannot be open to the whole universe anymore. In fact, even within certain realms I want to start limiting it to a few weak planets or regions. I have to stop the inn from getting involved in any more universe-level threats. It would be best if I can choose what places the inn is open to or not. That way I can continue sending all the inn's workers to get trained at the temple. Speaking of which, how secure is the Midnight Realm? Can it be easily found by others? Because I've been hearing a lot about realm wars recently, and I absolutely do not want to get involved in something like that anytime soon. Speaking of security, why are you so adamant on not giving me anything to defend myself with? For all the amazing features you claim to give me, hardly any serve to protect me. If it weren't for the ability to hire security for events, the inn would have been destroyed multiple times already. Chapter 971 Can't Promise. Lex listed a few of his ideas out to the system to see how it reacted. He had many more items on the list, but he needed to go priority-wise. For example, he was also curious as to how exactly the inn ensured any external worker he hired would stay loyal. Even if he didn't count the fact that Zagan could wake up at any moment and possibly resume its monster lifestyle, he expected in the future he would get the opportunity to hire many talented workers, not all of whom can be replaced by the workers that Lex hires through the system. He still had a bounty on the head of that craven who attacked the Midnight Tavern, and whoever killed him would on doubt be extremely powerful as well as ambitious. Lex had no problem with his workers being ambitious so long as they didn't turn it against the inn. The system did not respond immediately. It glowed and hummed and buzzed, no doubt processing his request and trying to figure out the best possible outcome. Whether through the lockdown, or by any other means, the inn cannot stop accepting new guests for too long. So a complete shutdown is out of the question, though for a certain amount of time it should be fine. Controlling where the inn is accessible from, that's a pretty advanced feature that requires a lot of authority. Since you're not even fusing with me then, the best I can do is offer it as a reward for a quest. But the quest difficulty will be high, and it will require a high rating as well. Even then, it won't be exactly as you wish. There is no way you can control the cultivation level of the guests you receive, but you can limit access to the inn to planets that have been linked to the system already, maybe. It depends on your performance. Moving on to matters of security. I would like to tell you that the Midnight Realm is completely safe and secure, but unfortunately I cannot do that. The previous location of the inn was completely hidden because of its small size. The new Midnight Realm will most likely be a massive strain on me. Chances are high that your innkeeper authority won't even extend to the entire realm. That's not how this works, the system responded sullenly. Lex suddenly felt awkward. The system was clearly in a bad mood, but Lex's time was limited so he couldn't stop with his requests. Should he just move on? If it's any consolation, I've been doing my best to get you other systems to absorb. I don't need your consolation, the system responded, though its sunnier voice told a different story. Move on. What else do you want? If there's nothing left, I have the development of a realm to oversee. There are still a couple of things. I want to know how you can ensure that new workers obey the inn's rules. Is there some kind of punishment? If not, how can I ensure they won't turn against me? There were plenty of ways to make sure workers, such as Zagan, stay loyal. Lex himself preferred to let everyone be afraid of his Downlord realm. But fear as a deterrent only worked on those with something to lose, or someone who was sane. He needed some kind of restriction from the system that would help. When someone joins the inn, they will feel more amenable to it. But that's the extent of what I can do. I've already given you great leeway with the workers you can hire. Chapter 972 Precautions. Feel more amenable? Lex repeated. That was disappointing to say the least. But since when have things been easy for Lex? Instead of such random things, you should focus more on ways to actually run the inn. Those are the things I can actually help with, the system said. Also, don't forget that for every request you make, you ultimately have to pay a price. This gave Lex pause. He had more requests to make, though their priority was down the list. Unfortunately, all the requests that he had that were related to how the inn was actually run were much less important than the other requests he had. Let me ask you a question. How come you're responding to me right now, and have never done so before? Does this mean you will respond to me in the future as well? If the situation about this new realm is uncertain, I might want to make some changes accordingly. I can't. This is a unique situation because of all the potent energy inside the realm that I can use. Even then, the only reason I am able to do so is because I want to burn off as much of the energy in this realm as possible to prevent it from becoming too big. Under normal circumstances, if you want to talk to me, then you need to bring my functionality back to at least 50%. Lex paused. Did he have to think of precautionary measures beforehand? He glanced at Mary for a moment. The system did not immediately respond. It only hummed for a moment, as if considering its answer. But, eventually, it said, I will let Mary provide an answer for that. Surprised, Lex looked at Mary. At lower levels, you may think that everything mystical or magical comes from systems. But at higher levels you will realize that the systems are not all powerful, otherwise the universe itself would have long been ruled by system users. You may suspect that the Emporium is a system, but that is because you are yourself quite weak. When you see something that is beyond the scope of your understanding, you automatically attribute it to a system. But when you touch upon laws, you will realize that some beings are much more powerful than you realize. Cornelius, the king of the Hum Empire in the Crystal Realm, is a good example of that. Cornelius? But isn't he just in the Earth Immortal realm? Lex was genuinely surprised that, of everyone he'd met, Mary listed him as an example. After all, Cassandra and Jotun were celestial immortals, and much more powerful than Cornelius. Yes, he is just an Earth Immortal, in the way that you are just in the Golden Core realm. The point is, the Midnight Inn is well hidden from other system users and weaker systems. Based on the power scale that the Innkeeper has shown himself to be a part of, even if someone suspects that the Inn is a part of a system, they will have to be much more powerful to test you out. In that case, if you really end up facing someone with a system of strength that high, you won't be able to protect yourself anyway. So you need not worry. That was reassuring, somewhat. So either Lex would not have any issues, or face an issue so massive that he could not avoid it. It would be best if he could. Wait, that was so obvious. He should have asked for that first. Can I get another one of those full-strength butter knife tokens? Lex asked. If he could get his hands on those, then a lot of his troubles would automatically go away. Chapter 973 Finally. The system glowed, but not in the previous ways, where it seemed to be thinking. The glow was a lot more intense, yet short. If you think I have all quest rewards lying around somewhere, that's not how it works. If you want something like that, you have to get them through quests. Quest rewards that focus on unlocking features of the inn, I can influence. But if the quest reward has to do with other, external items, then I have no control over that. You should just do more quests. As I recall, you still have 5 active quests. The system sounded embarrassed and angry. Lex had once again, unwittingly, stepped on its toes, as it were. As for his active quests, they were beyond his current means. His oldest quest, to establish a permanent resident district, could not be done even if he wanted to because its most basic of 3 requirements was to raise the inn to 3 stars, and it was still 2.5 stars. Perhaps the new realm might affect that, but that would still leave him without a winding road vine and a karmic lily, both incredibly rare treasures. Even the Infinity Emporium did not have them. Then there was a quest to connect to Dunya, a 5-star world. With all the trouble he was getting into with lower star worlds, he still did not dare to connect to it. He had no interest in having a Henali assembly at the inn anytime soon, he had no control over when a deity would come to the inn as a guest, and he was already doing his best to speed up the recovery of the system. That left him with a bunch of quests he could not complete, at least for now. Lex sighed, and said, "Can you at least make the soul hearth a permanent part of the inn? I also need a dungeon where I can keep prisoners and prevent them from escaping. Both of these are important." Since he could not directly fight off against enemies, he would have to lean into the deterrent factor. Although he could fill the heart and keep it running with MP, it was too expensive to keep it going long term. "I'll give you a few quests with related rewards," the system said succinctly. The system continued to hum and vibrate for a whole minute, its glow rising and dropping as if it was breathing. Ultimately, the glow stabilized, and the system started to speak once more. Before I leave, you should know that the system bias is not for no reason. Beings lower on the cosmic spectrum usually perform worse off. Your performance has been an outlier, not a norm. So continue to do a good job, and continue to raise your level. I look forward to working with you. Like a shy kid, running off stage after giving a speech, the system returned to its old place within Lex's soul, and settled down as it turned its attention away. Outside, the realm continued to change, and the system had to maintain control of it. After all, it was keeping all the guests, workers, and property in a separate realm outside the new Midnight Realm so that they would not be affected by the timeline of the new realm. It was not easy, and required a lot of control. Lex turned to look at Mary once more. She looked relieved, somehow. Did you think that was going to go worse than it did? Lex asked. I did not know how the system would react to your demands, and how you would react to the information it provided. The potential for a catastrophe was high. But, ultimately, I think the system was impressed by your performance so far. After all, it is not so easy to get such a high rating on quests, regardless of one's cultivation level. There's still a lot left unsaid, Lex repeated, as if clarifying that he was not perfectly satisfied with the result. But this is acceptable, for now. I will stop treating the system with such suspicion, unless it does something else that makes me wary. Good luck, Mary said, before disappearing. Lex closed his eyes. It was time to continue his breakthrough. Finally, he was entering the nascent realm. Chapter 974 Straight out of Legends. Under Lex's current circumstances, time was difficult to measure. He personally felt like only seconds were passing, but on the ground below him thousands of years were going by. The great expanse that Lex had seen as one single landform eventually broke into three. Between the three landforms was a sea, but the liquid that filled the sea was not water. The unknown liquid changed colors according to its movement, from silver when it was calm to dark blue when it rose into waves. In between, those two states a myriad of other colors filled it, always moving and changing like a perpetually evolving canvas. If Lex would have observed the sea, he would have been amazed at how the changing colors seemed to replicate pictures of galaxies he had seen back on Earth. The movement of the water, the change in the colors, all seemed to coincide with the movement of multiple galaxies as they moved through space. Countless years passed and the realms began to slowly stabilize, and the perpetual changes seemed to be reducing as well. The three land masses also stopped moving apart from one another, as if they had reached some kind of equilibrium. Trillions of tiny islands formed around the three land masses, but never too far from the safety of its shores as the cosmic waters were too perilous, with storms and currents too strong, to allow small islands to exist on their own. Cassandra, who too was forced to enter a meditative state due to the purity of the energy she absorbed, sensed something. She could not help but open her eyes, and when she looked down at the three land masses her body trembled. The three realms. The heaven, nether and mortal realms. Suddenly she closed her eyes, not daring to look further. She sensed that she had seen something she absolutely should not have. Perhaps that was why the Innkeeper allowed her to access some of the realm energy. It was a subtle way to inform her she needed to stop observing. She could only hope she was not punished for prying. Massive lakes of lava covered one area of one continent, while massive glaciers that rose into the sky could cover the other side. Mountains of pure spirit crystals rose into the skies, and vitality-rich elixirs rained from clouds filled with a platinum glow. Yet somehow, in this chaos, life was finding a way to survive, but only in the form of extremely resilient plants, for now. More time passed, and eventually there came a time when Cassandra noticed something. The rate of time flow in the continents below them had, for the very first time, slowed down just a bit. If previously a second was 1,000 years, then now it was 999 years. The isolation barrier around everyone thinned once more, and another stream of energy came flooding in. This time, Cassandra did not dare to peek. As it happened, the moment she closed her eyes, for the first time. A snake was born on the middle continent, its massive size dwarfing the crystal mountains. As if testing itself, the snake slithered the continent for a time, its body sprawling across the entire continent itself, before finding a spot to settle down and enter hibernation. Its body formed artificial features across the continent, influencing the climate and altering the development of content itself. Eventually, its body was covered in dust and dirt and earth, forming a series of hills that traveled the entire continent in a meandering path. Moments later, on the smallest continent, a tree was born. This was the first actual tree in the entire realm, and as the days went by it grew and grew without pause, as if it did not know when to stop. Eventually, its canopy covered nearly half the continent, giving it perpetual shade, and forming a mini-climate underneath it, separated from that of the rest of the continent. Then, on the third and largest continent, an 8-legged horse opened its eyes. Chapter 975 Final Change. Lex, of course, knew none of this. He had completely lost himself in his cultivation. There came a point in which he was undergoing the change where his mind became numb and he lost all awareness. His sense of time, of self, of anything and everything was lost. This was the most dangerous part of his cultivation, and was the reason why cultivators completely isolate themselves before they undergo any cultivation or breakthroughs, major or minor. Right now, he was completely vulnerable, with no possible way to protect himself at all. The extreme danger of this state was one of the primary reasons why humans on Earth were not able to break through to this realm despite having thousands of golden core cultivators. Only very extreme or unique circumstances would create the situation that allowed this to happen. But ironically, despite being surrounded by countless people and hanging over a changing landscape, Lex was much safer right now than if he took any precautions of his own. The isolation barrier could protect him, even from the dangers of a newborn realm, let alone anything else. An enemy would have to be incredibly strong to even harm him in this state. Eventually, as a result of Lex's hard work and preparation, he passed this period without any issue. When his sense of self returned, reality felt different. It took him some time to adjust. It was like before this he was looking at a video in 240 pixel resolution, with the sound incredibly muffled, and every other sense of his being suppressed. But now, he was looking at reality with, the clarity was beyond any comparison Lex could make. Let alone 4K or 8K screens, even 100K would not be enough to describe what he was seeing. Even though he was surrounded by silence, due to the isolation barrier, even that sounded amazing. The feeling of just the air touching his skin was so incredibly smooth, so the texture of his clothes was in another realm entirely. Lex suddenly had a deeper appreciation for why the inn had a tailor. Higher-level cultivators would feel 1,000 times worse than a normal person if their clothes were coarse, or made from uncomfortable fabrics. All his senses were so powerful that, despite Lex's once again increased mental capacity, he was overwhelmed by the initial exposure. It took him a few seconds to get over the sheer amount of detail that was being flooded into his mind, and make sense of them. It wasn't because his brain was not equipped to handle such a vast amount of information, it was just that he wasn't used to it. It was like a strong man picking up a weapon or tool they weren't used to. Although physically they could handle it, that did not mean that they could effortlessly start deploying it. Then Lex looked beyond himself and discovered that he was still floating up in the air. But the situation around him was drastically different. The land mass beneath him had split into three, but despite his increased senses, Lex could not view them due to the dense platinum clouds that covered the skies. He still could only see the smallest continent, which had the massive tree in the center. If there was one plus point, it was that new realms usually did not have a tolerance for very high cultivation levels. So, most likely, he would just have to deal with mythical beings and descendants of mythical beings who were constrained to whatever the realm limit of this new realm was. He was not concerned about his guests not being able to survive, because he knew that the system would find a way for guests to exist without issue, much in the way it previously protected all other guests from the passive aura of high-level cultivators. As the hours rolled by, Lex could tell that time was slowing down considerably now. The expansion and collapse of empires had also stopped, as a balance was eventually formed. How delicate that balance was, he would have to find out for himself later on. But the strongest entities lived closest to the massive tree, at least that much was clear. Lex wondered how large the tree actually was. If this were placed on Earth, it would easily exit the atmosphere, and that was not even considering if the Earth was large enough to hold the tree. For now, Lex still could not accurately scale how large or small the continent and everything that inhabited it was. The isolation barrier around them suddenly thinned once again, allowing a stream of energy to reach them. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, a massive storm covered the entire realm at the same time. The clouds, which had turned black, covered everything so that the continent was not visible at all from their angle. Everyone, Lex included, entered another round of cultivation. But there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Lex could feel it, and so could everyone else. The realm was undergoing another change, and he had a strong feeling that this would be the last change before they finally descended. Anticipation gripped Lex, before he was suddenly and completely taken aback by what was happening to him. His attention was completely focused solely on himself for a brief moment. His cultivation was rising rapidly. In fact, this growth was the fastest he ever experienced, drawing even the time in the crystal realm where he ate the blue crystal essence and reached the peak of the foundation realm. He could feel his soul becoming more solid, before he felt a small crack in his body. He just entered the middle of the nascent realm. The energy he absorbed from the realm was pure, but it wasn't as if Lex hadn't had pure energy before. No, the main difference was that it contained a tremendous amount of vitality that was boosting his cultivation forcefully. Lex immediately took control of the energy pushing his cultivation and began using his cultivation technique. Such a quick advancement was not necessarily for the best. He had to make sure he was on the path of stable growth. Finally, after a few seconds, his growth stopped right before he reached the late stage of the nascent realm, and the energy began nourishing him in other ways under the influence of his technique. Information flooded his mind of the abilities he had gained. Chapter 976 Emergency Quest. Originally Lex wanted to ignore delving into his new abilities since he wanted to focus on the realm instead. But the unexpected rise in his cultivation realm forced him to pay attention to the changes. The first and most basic change was that with his increased soul strength, the amount of strength he could display while using the same amount of spiritual energy increased exponentially. This was a straightforward increase with no hidden complexities. But, as a result of this increase, Lex could finally do something pretty cool. He had not felt the lack of this particular ability just because of how he was nearly omnipotent within the inn, and had other means outside of it such as teleportation. Regardless, now he could use his spirit sense to fly. There were a couple of ways of going about it, which he would have to experiment with to see which yielded better results. Not to mention, he had already prepared a whole host of manuals and techniques for himself for the nascent realm from the Emporium. He could also consult them for advice. Basically, the two ways of flying he could think of right now either depended on ambient spirit energy or the ground. He could use his spirit sense to push himself off the ground and fly around. As long as his spirit sense was touching the ground, he could control himself relative to it. The second way was to use spiritual energy and sort of latch on to the spirit energy in the air around him and use that to fly. This was cool, and Lex would definitely recreate any number of superhero poses with it later in his free time. But for now, he could not dwell on it as more information entered his mind. The spirit energy Lex absorbed from the air would undergo a change and would develop according to Lex's own unique mix of affinities, making his energy distinctive. Once it could have been called regal affinity, but as of right now, it had no name as Lex had to name it himself. The important part of that was that previously, through the use of impervious hands, Lex could touch any number of intangible things. While he still would have to rely on the technique for other things, Lex had gained the ability to interact with laws on his own. That interaction could be through spiritual manipulation or through physical touch. Technically speaking, his influence over laws was still premature, since that was something would gain proper mastery over when he became an immortal. But for now, he could at least interact with it. The next ability he gained was to enter into a soul state. This was pretty much expected, but what he did not expect was to gain the ability to enter the soul plane directly in his soul state. In hindsight, it should have been obvious, but he had not considered it. This presented numerous opportunities for Lex. After all, back when he was traveling to save the battalion, due to unstable space he had not been able to teleport over directly. Instead, he traveled through the soul plane using a treasure he got from the Emporium. Now, that was something he would be able to do on his own without the need for external aid. Another quite predictable ability he gained was to directly influence the souls of other beings. Whether it was through his attacks, physical touch, or even his aura, he could not use any and all of them to directly influence the souls of any living thing. At the same time he could do the reverse with soul-based techniques, such as evisceration. Instead of harming his target's soul, it could now directly harm their physique. This was not something all nascent soul cultivators got, but was specific to him due to soul state ability. They repeated a similar cycle, of expanding outwards before developing inwards. Monuments began to rise, pyramids were built, the power of nature was harnessed, and finally, when two growing empires met, borders were drawn. But before Lex could witness yet another war between major powers, the flow of time started to slow down rapidly. Lex's connection to the system also strengthened rapidly until, finally, he heard a sound all too familiar. New notification: Midnight Realm has stabilized. The Midnight Inn is ready to once again become operational. New notification: error. Arrow and 92 ***. New notification: emergency protocols initiating. Issuing emergency quest. Emergency quest: system failure detected. Immediately restore the system to minimum 35% functionality before permanent system shutdown. Quest time limit: 399 days. Quest reward: return of normal system functionality. Quest failure: permanent system failure. Permanent loss of all Midnight Inn services and features. Remarks: due to massive operational load, the system cannot function. Many integral system features are inoperational. New notification: due to severe overload, teleportation functions are inoperable. New notification: due to severe overload, Chamber of Secrets, Fire Tempering Room, Fishing Well, Greenhouse, Guild Room, Hot Tub Room, Inheritance Lounge, Lightning Tempering Room, Meditation Room, Mystery Trial, Recovery Rooms, including pods and organic reconstruction rooms, Security Room, Training Room and other inn services are inoperable. New notification: due to severe overload, Host Attire will stop working in 10 days. New notification: energy reserve for basic functioning of system services has been allocated. The operational size of the Midnight Inn will be 1 million acres. Please select the location for the deployment of the Midnight Inn. Chapter 977 Big. Lex carefully read through the notifications. He remained composed throughout, for he was already mentally prepared to face some issues with this relocation. The shutdown of the teleportation feature would be, by far, the most problematic, since it would prevent any of the guests who wanted to leave from departing. Forcing them to stay here for hundreds of days was not good for the inn's image. But that was the least of his concerns at the moment. In front of him, a panel appeared with a map of the entire realm. The discovery of the fact that there were continents like the one below him, with the other two being even larger, left him both amazed and concerned. On the map, the size of the entire realm was detonated as 0.25 light-years. That included the cosmic sea that surrounded the continents as well, but still that was massive. He did not think about that for now. Although there were 2 other continents, Lex did not know what the situation on them was. At least he had seen the progress for the one below him with his own eyes and had an overall understanding of its development and history, as well as its climate and topography. He dismissed the other 2 continents and focused on the one below him. If, perhaps, he was not on such a tight deadline, he may have thoroughly explored his options, and even considered the other 2. This was because the map was extremely detailed and could provide any kind of information Lex needed. But as it was, just searching through this continent was going to be a hassle. This was because, according to the map, the size of this continent was 81 quadrillion acres. That was 81 quadrillion acres. For all intents and purposes, Lex did not even try to visualize how massive that was, as he simply labeled it as big. That was enough. It was so monstrously massive that he probably would not even be able to explore it in a million years if he had to, as he was right now. There was no point in calculating how many football stadiums or washing machines that was equivalent to. It was simply big. On the map, he highlighted areas where there was any kind of county, kingdom, empire, or basically any kind of civilization. Countless dots appeared, but compared to the size of the continent, they were minuscule. He would avoid all such areas for the development of the inn. Then he chose to highlight areas rich in resources, with plenty of land, water, and open terrain. He also chose to ignore any area close to the tree. Although the tree was no doubt a massive attraction, and could probably offer countless benefits, it harbored too many races nearby, who were very protective of it. Since he had no idea how the inhabitants of the land would react to the inn, he had to avoid them for now, even if it meant forsaking an excellent spot for the inn. While he was looking, it suddenly occurred to him to check what the air in this realm consisted of, and what the gravity here was. But the moment he thought of it, the answer arrived. Eventually, they found themselves over the designated spot for the inn, and Lex realized why there had been no immediate notification. A massive, transparent barrier was being erected, covering the entire region. Although there were no physical changes being made, Lex could tell that the place was somehow being prepared for their arrival. Cassandra could see even more, as she realized that the laws within that specific region were being treated to allow her and other more powerful guests to exist without issue. After all, there were a number of immortals among the guests, and the fragile environment of the new realm could not support their existence. The process was not quick, and took a long time. But as progress on the barrier increased, the flow of time began to noticeably decrease. No longer were the seasons passing by indistinguishably. The brief moments of an extremely colorful spring, the vibrance of summer, the melancholy of autumn, and the coziness of winter all became easily distinguishable. Those who were awake saw countless such cycles pass by over the region which would now be the Midnight Inn. As time slowed down further, Lex could finally make out the wildlife. They were still moving too fast to get a clear view of for now, but they all seemed to share a common trait. They were all massive. A full-grown elephant or a whale from Earth would look like a newborn cub when faced with these creatures. It was then that Lex began to notice, perhaps because the platform was subtly descending, that everything in this continent was much bigger than he was used to. Each and every tree rose hundreds of feet. The mountains dwarfed the mountain man as if he were nothing. Just the grass itself was dozens of feet tall. Lex could not help but sigh. He was already tiny, and now he was transported to a world of giants. He felt like he was in Gulliver's Travels, but in reverse. When the flow of time slowed down till it was almost normal, Lex finally got the notification he was waiting for. New notification: the Midnight Inn's territory has been clearly marked and prepared for habitation. Place down all of the inn's property and establish a thriving environment for the guests. New notification: time flow for the Midnight Realm has stabilized at X3 of the previous territory. New room charge procedures will need to be dictated according to the flow of time depending on the guest's point of origin. New notification: the Midnight Tavern has been temporarily shut down and removed. Chapter 978 New Layout. Lex was reminded of his very first day at the inn, when he created the Midnight Manor and created a small road and plain garden. It was so simple, and comparatively empty back then. To be fair, he was also limited by the amount of MP he had back then. Now, although he had a lot more MP, it would not be nearly enough if he had to design the entire new territory of the inn on his own. Fortunately, that was not a concern, as it already contained a complicated terrain, formed naturally over the course of a few million years. He looked at his territory and very seriously contemplated how he wanted to arrange the new setup. He still had all the buildings, items, and even the trees and grass from the previous inn, not to mention the countless worms, insects, and animals. He first had to choose where the main hub of his inn would be, as he would start out by placing all the items he already had nearby. Since he had only 10 days with the host attire, he planned on developing the entire territory, to some extent, but for now he would keep everything close together. He had not forgotten that there were countless wild beasts inhabiting his territory, and he still did not know how they would react. Ordinarily, if the system were functioning normally, he would assume that they were also a part of the inn and so would obey his orders. But he had not felt a connection develop with them yet. On the bright side, once he managed to get the situation under control, his long-standing problem of having no meat source for the inn would finally be resolved. After some consideration, Lex decided to place all the inn buildings close to the largest lake in his territory. The bay it formed was visually pleasing, and it would serve as a source of water, not that he needed to source his water from the land. But it would be a convenience for his aquatic and semi-aquatic guests, of which he had quite a few. He also imagined that Little Blue would like to finally have a body of water large enough for it to explore properly, though considering that it was sprouting wings, it might not have such a fondness for the water in the future. With a hint of nostalgia filling him, Lex placed the Midnight Manor as the first building in his new realm. It was now a beachfront property. The Midnight Mountain, which now looked more like an aspiring hill compared to the mountains in this realm, Lex placed far in the south, much farther than the distance between Main Street and the Bastion. This had been a signature part of the inn skyline previously, but now he suspected that it would lose much of its grandeur. As such, he wanted the mountain to become a place for a nature retreat. Besides meditation rooms and some cabins, there would be no other service provided here. There wouldn't even be any public transport or roads. If anyone wanted to come, they would have to trek themselves, not that it was much of an issue for cultivators. The party village, which really needed a new name, came to the manor's west, and was relatively closer. He took this opportunity to rearrange it somewhat, as a glance was more than enough for his newly enhanced mental capabilities to design a better layout. He also had the space to have it spread out quite a bit. He placed the path for the orient between Main Street, the village, and the Bastion. However, he did place a number of unconnected tracks through the surrounding wilderness in case he wanted to expand the route in the future. The small, flying glass city Lex placed over the actual lake itself, and designed a set route for it to roam. The landing platform he placed southeast of the manor, so that arriving guests could choose between the Bastion and Main Street, though that would not be a concern for a while. These were the main settlements, but over the course of time, Lex had placed countless unnamed small villages throughout the inn, which had been booked for years in advance by numerous organizations which wanted to use the inn as a kind of base of operations. Chapter 979 New Layout 2. Lex dotted these in the vast open areas around his 3 main settlements, allowing them to have privacy, but at the same time not be too far away from any main part of the inn. The Fire Temple, he placed further east of the Bastion. It had never received a guest so far, and he was not expecting to find one any time soon. There were a number of underwater settlements he placed in the lake as well, which was surprisingly fresh water despite its massive size. Lex found it hard to believe that such a large body of water somehow remained fresh without any external factors. Perhaps there were some kind of aquatic plants or animals which filtered out all the salts and heavy metals from the water. But if such things existed, they at least weren't within the inn's boundary as far as he could tell. Speaking of the boundary, Lex spent 13 billion MP and created a massive boundary wall all along the edge of the 1 million acres of the inn's territory. He had made sure that the wall was made from extremely sturdy material, and rose 300 feet, 90 meters, in the air. Although he did not expect to actually keep any formidable enemies out using the wall alone, should they ever arrive, it at least served as a clear division between what was a part of the inn and what wasn't. He would have liked to place several formations along the wall as well, but the system was not currently providing him with any. Something noteworthy was that the wall dipped into the cosmic sea to enclose the small area that was within the inn's territory did not last long. Lex was unsure if it corroded, or withered away or was just disintegrated directly, but it vanished completely, leaving no traces. So that, at least, answered his question about the dangers of the cosmic sea. The only problem was that unless he got his hands on a specific material or treasure, he would not get a notification informing him if it would work to heal the system. Doing that manually would be incredibly difficult, and would be worse than looking for a needle in a haystack. So for the remaining 10 days, as soon as he gained the liberty to move around freely, besides developing the inn, he intended to use the host attire to teleport all over the territory to every location which contained valuable resources and get his hands on them. It was a race against the clock, and these few days were going to be critical. Depending on the level of his success, he would then decide on how desperate he needed to be during the remaining 1 year. Either way, it was not going to be easy. But he believed it was entirely possible. After all, if it wasn't, the system would have let him know somehow, or it would have used its energy to give him some kind of hope. If things truly did not end well, he still had 2 hostages who were a part of the group hunting for systems. He would have to see how useful they could really be. 104. Just as Lex was planning his future actions, he finally heard the familiar sound of the system. But it was not a notification. New quest. Chapter 980 Perfectly ambiguous. New quest. The Midnight Realm is property of the Midnight Inn, but the realm is also home to countless others. As the innkeeper, you can be magnanimous, but you cannot be unknown in your own home. Inaugurate the new location of the Midnight Inn, and make yourself known across the realm. Quest reward, activation of basic inn services. Remarks, for your own sake, do not procrastinate, for once. Lex read the quests and was thankful that he had not received one of the punishment quests he was told he would get. But maybe, in some way, this was a nearly impossible quest to fulfill. That was because, ordinarily, all he needed to do was spread his aura as the innkeeper and it would suppress those who felt it. But at the moment, the effects of the host attire were limited to the territory of the inn. How was he supposed to make himself known across the entire realm? As it turned out, it was not so hard. It only took him a moment to come up with a possible solution, but he had to be sure it would work before trying it. He couldn't afford to make himself look idiotic, at least while appearing as the innkeeper. Although he could not ask the system himself, he had a trusty intermediary for the process. "Mary, if I use interrealm broadcast to the same realm, will that work?" he asked. Interrealm broadcast was the feature that allowed him to connect to the crystal realm from the origin realm, and possibly any other realm he unlocked. It caused a delay, but it allowed golden keys to be used across realms. Theoretically, it could also enable other features of the inn. So if it worked, then it would be very simple to spread not only his aura, but his image and his words across the entire realm. Mary appeared before him, this time dressed as if she were cosplaying a cave woman. Most of the inn services are shut down, including the interrealm broadcast. You can manually turn it on, but that will take away from the amount of time you have with the host attire functioning. Is the guest registry shut down as well? Lex asked suddenly. That was one of his major concerns for the new realm. Using it as a spatial anchor, he had been able to teleport over. That was all good and well when he needed it, but he did not want the spatial coordinates of his new realm being broadcasted out to a bunch of random people. It was not the kind of thing he wanted to leave to chance. Yup. Basically, other than aura suppression, realm support and housing, none of the other inn's functions are available. Realm support, by the way, means it's supporting those guests whose cultivation level is above what is allowed by the Midnight Realm. Lex did not mean to drag the matter on. As the innkeeper, his every public appearance was short and to the point. It was a persona he purposefully created, and one he intended on maintaining. That was the sole reason, and not at all because he did not want to waste his time keeping the interrealm broadcast active. "Some of you may already know me," he began, softly. He did not need to raise his voice when his words automatically carried to every living being in the whole realm. "Most of you will not. I am the innkeeper, but that hardly matters. What is important, however, is that I have created this realm for my inn, the Midnight Inn. The Midnight Inn is a place where travelers from all over can come to rest and relax amidst the vicissitudes of life. It is a place free from worry and strife, and welcomes all to enjoy its warmth. With this new realm, the inn faces a new beginning. With this realm, the inn has become a unique place in the universe. A mysterious place, cut off from the machinations of other forces, and free from the obligations and duties that come with being tied to others. With this realm, the inn will finally become a place that welcomes any who seek refuge, whether it be during their travels, from the fatigue of daily life, or from some other burden they have carried too long. But as the inn grows into the mantle it has claimed, we cannot forget those who also call this realm home. To you, who have inhabited these lands for years untold, the inn also opens its doors, if you wish to come. But if you wish to continue your way of life, as your ancestors did before you, then you will not be disturbed, as long as you do not disturb the inn. You may continue to live as you always have, in this realm I created. Lex paused, as he considered if he wanted to add anything else. This speech was much more difficult than it seemed. As the innkeeper, he could not make any promise he could not keep. He wanted to say that his guests will not leave the territory of the inn, but he could not say for certain that would always be the case. He also wanted to say that the inn won't encroach upon their territories. After all, this was a growing realm. New lands would eventually come for him to occupy if he wished. But still, he could not say for certain that the inn wouldn't need to grow, and that he may occupy more territory. While he wanted to stay true to his conscience, he also had to be ambiguous enough to accommodate any eventuality in the future. When it came to ambiguity, there was nothing greater than the domain of fate. With this, the official establishment of the Midnight Inn, the destiny of this realm will forever change. It is up to those who wish to grasp it, to seize this opportunity once and for all. There, a perfectly open-ended sentence that could mean anything he wished. He withdrew his aura, finally disabling the inter-realm broadcast. Although his speech was barely over a minute long, he was sure that the time it took away from the availability of the host attire was greater than that. A familiar ting sounded in his mind, but before he could check it, he along with every other guest and worker, were finally teleported away from the platform in the sky, and to the inn. A flood of information rushed into Lex's mind, about the new limitations of the inn, and this realm as well.